Welcome, everybody, to this CX Summit session on leveraging the power of conversational AI. I'm your host, Zeus Kerravala, Principal Analyst in ZK Research, and I'm thrilled to be doing this session because I think conversational AI is a fascinating topic. I've written quite a bit on this topic. It's evolved a lot over the last 2 years, and I'm joined by two really smart guys here. The first is Stuart Dorman, the Chief Innovation Officer at Sabio, and Dave Jennings, who's the Head of Sales Engineering at Cisco. And so before we start, Stu, why don't you say hello to everybody? Tell us a little bit about what Sabio does and tell us about your role.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. So, hi, Stu Dorman. As you mentioned, I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Sabio. I've been there since it was a startup 20 odd years ago. We are a kind of customer experience and digital transformation focused organization. We help our clients to use technology to really transform the customer experiences. A lot of it's centered in and around the contact center. Most of it these days is touched by conversational AI in some shape or form. I'm sure we can explore that a bit later on. We do a lot around providing sort of CRM desktop tools for advisors as well. So it's all about really helping people deliver better customer experiences through technology.
Okay, and Dave, what do you do at Cisco?
Yeah, so we were actually part of an acquisition 15, 16 months ago. iMyMobile is who we were, and I head up a team focused on CPaaS. We're a CPaaS provider, communication platform as a service. And a little bit similar to Stu, we look at kind of revolutionizing CX by creating those dynamic, always-on connections between brands and consumers across digital messaging channels predominantly.
Yeah, and in fact, I believe I was supposed to refer to you as Dave Jennings of iMyMobile, a Webex company, right? So I think that's
we are now a full Webex company. iMyMobile is pretty much a thing of the past now. So we're our platform is rebranded as part of Webex, and yes, we're fully embraced by the Cisco Webex brand.
Okay,
Yep.
So let's start off let's level set here definition. The term conversational AI, while it's a broad term, when I read things that have been written in the media about it, I even saw Gartner and Q on their conversational AI, Magic Quadrant. People seem to use it in a very narrow way, though, where it's thought of as something that enables bots, right? And to me, that's really wasting the power of what conversational AI could be. And so, from a definitional perspective, let's start with you, Stu. What is conversational AI? When somebody says that, what should they be thinking about?
So I think to start with, if you break it down, at its core, you've got a set of services that allow people, firstly, those services are able to understand language. That could be text, someone writing a message or a text, or it could be, understanding speech. And there are separate services, that are focused on speech recognition, powered these days by machine learning, and another set of services that are designed to understand the context of language. And within that, so if I ask a question, for example, the first thing that you might want to do is establish what that question is that I'm asking. So we call that the intent. So firstly, we need to understand the intent of the conversation. And then within that as well, we can also start to pick out specific bits of information from that conversation. Often they're called entities, but useful bits of information that can be used to to understand more about the context and to help progress the conversation to get the right outcome from the caller. And then if you bring all of that together, often what most people think of these days when they think about conversational AI is a voice bot or a chat bot, which allows a customer to complete a task through conversation, messaging or chat or voice conversation to accomplish a goal without the need to speak to a human. And really the first wave, if you like, of the application of conversational AI was focused on those bots. And we'll come and maybe talk about the second wave later on, which is thinking about other ways in which that can be used to support humans. But in essence, that's kind of how I describe conversational AI.
And Dave, do you have anything to add to that?
I think you're spot on, Stu. We're talking intents, entities, dialogue. I think you even mentioned what's almost maybe to some of my team in the product side a slightly dirty word in the chatbot. They see conversational AI and chatbot as two different things, and I think that's probably one of the biggest maybe misnomers or confusions within the space. And I think for us, actually having come 10 years out of the messaging kind of binary keyword back and forth with a customer, that's a chatbot for us. And they're very rule-based, very well-defined. And as Stu mentioned, I think that you're taking natural language processing, intents, entities, dialogue. And the ultimate difference for me between chatbot and conversational AI is the ability to handle human variants. I think that's where we can start to look at them as slightly two different aspects.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'd agree with that. I think what's really transformed this whole space over the last few years in particular is the application of machine learning technology to the art of conversational AI. As Dave said, exactly, years ago, you would have to almost program a set of rules to construct a conversation, which meant that conversation ended up being very rigid and prescriptive. And if a customer went off piste or asked a question in a way that you hadn't anticipated, the system really struggled to respond.
Right.
With machine learning underpinning that conversation, it means that it gives designers of conversational AI much more flexibility in terms of how they build that conversation, and it means that it's able to understand a much broader range of customers' questions and respond in a much more accurate way.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to talk about. That just from an industry perspective. I've been following the role of bots bots are nothing new. We've had bots for a decade. Right, but the satisfaction level with customers and bots is pretty low. In fact, I've had some of my UC analyst colleagues just flat out say bots don't work, and they don't work when they're rules based because, as you mentioned, Stu, you got to keep those rules up to date. And so I think the infusion of conversational AI into virtual agents, has created this thing called IVAs, right, intelligent virtual agents that actually have advanced a long way. And so from a market perspective, right, the term conversational AI, it's been around a while, so have bots. What's driving the interest in it today? And Dave, I know, Cisco's got an awfully large customer base. Maybe we'll start with you on that. What are some of the what's created this new wave of interest?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you mentioned something that I was going to kind of touch on. And I think to some degree, chatbots, as they're most commonly known in the market, when we talk about conversational AI maybe being an evolution of that, is probably more augmented. We're probably more an augmented intelligence stage than we are an artificial intelligence stage. I think people expect, from a customer perspective, that you can ask it anything. And even brands, they think when they come to you and ask for a chatbot, ask it anything and it will understand and it will give you what you're looking for. I think part of the explosion really in the demand pretty comes from the likes of the Amazon Alexas, the Siris, and people are becoming more familiar with having those conversational experiences in their day-to-day lives. And I think maybe with chatbots, and to some degree, sometimes the evolution is also on the customer side. The technology maybe was a bit ahead of the customer, and the customer wasn't too familiar with the experience and didn't know how to interact with it. And I think they've got to meet in the middle a little bit. I think customers have got to learn how they can engage with conversational AI, not in the same way they would necessarily with a human, but also brands have got to make sure they design experiences that customers want to engage with, right? Because if they don't want to engage with your conversational AI, your bot, whatever it is, they're not going to use it, and they're going to see it as a barrier to get to your business or to get to the answer, as opposed to something that's delivering great customer experience.
Well, there's certainly this drive towards better customer experience. Every company I talk to now competes on the basis of it. But to your point, there is some risk involved, right? In fact, my research shows that last year in the U.S., anyways, 2/3 of millennials admitted they changed loyalties to a brand because of a single bad experience. And anybody that uses bots, I think, has had a bad experience in the past. And so, Stu, are there other things that you're seeing that's kind of driving the interest here?
Yeah, I think, again, just to build on Dave's point, we obviously saw the launch of Alexa back in 2014, 2015. And that introduced the public to this idea of a computer, whose primary user interface was voice and conversation instead of a keyboard, which was what we were all used to before. So I think that started to get people more comfortable dealing with voice and dealing with conversation as a way of interacting with computers and accessing information. So there was that, combined with, as we talked about before, the application of machine learning, which meant that the barriers to entry for building actually quite complex and sophisticated voice bots and chatbots or conversational, user interfaces reduced quite significantly because you weren't having to program loads of predefined rules. And I think the third thing that's driven it as well is, every organization is undergoing a huge digital transformation program at the moment. And I think, the initial phases of that program was that, okay, let's build a graphical user interface. Let's build a website for customers. And, guess what? They're going to go and do everything on the website. They'll solve all of their problems and they won't need to speak to a human anymore and will save loads of cost. The reality is that people either aren't able to find the information on those graphical user interfaces, and therefore we need to provide something conversational that's more natural to them to express their intent and solve their problem. Or, we know that 70% of demand into today's contact centers is still coming in via voice. So customers are choosing voice, which historically has been a very hard, if not impossible channel to digitize. And what conversational AI does on the voice channel is start to allow you to treat voice as a digital channel and start digitizing it, providing answers to questions that customers have, or at the very least establishing their intent and getting them through to the person that can solve their problem much quicker. So I think it's a combination of those factors really that's brought this to the forefront now and why there's so much interest in this field at the moment.
Now, Dave, you said something interesting, right? That brands need to create experiences, I think is what you said, that where their customers want to interact with the IVA or even through text or whatever. And if you do it wrong, then of course you create dissatisfaction with their customers, even though the intention might have been the opposite. So how do businesses think about that juxtaposition? How do they know where to deploy it, where not to deploy it, when you should use it, when you shouldn't use it? Because you can't use it for everything, but there's clearly use cases where it does make sense and then a bunch of gray area. So how do you exactly navigate that?
Yeah, and it's not easy. And I think I often think you've got to look at a customer's intention state, right? Are they in a kind of a crisis mode? Is it positive? Is it negative? Or is it neutral? And I think, to be honest, the easiest path is neutral when you're looking at these experiences, because maybe a bit cliche. Stu and I both talked about customer experience being king here, and that's kind of our backgrounds and what we're working towards. I think you've got to make things easier for a customer, more convenient for them. I think it's easier for conversational AI to work with, it's working with back-end systems, it's integrating with things to solve a task, right? To perform a task, to complete something for a customer, as opposed to understand the customer, empathize with them. We're not quite there yet, I think. So I look at it as things like order status updates, canceling orders, returning orders for a retailer, or things like changing the date or paying a bill. You get told a bill is due, completing quite simple tasks that maybe if you got through to a human, all they'd be going to a system and manually doing it themselves. So how can you, I guess, integrate automation of quite simple human tasks, but provide a conversational front end to make it easy and seamless for the customer to actually complete that task? If that answers your question to some degree.
I guess just to add to that as well, I think it's important not to think of it as either or. I think having a conversational front end, a conversational AI-driven front end to any conversation, even if you know that is going to end up with a human completing the task, is absolutely fine. It's about how you design that end-to-end journey. And as Dave said, really simple things, updates and payments and so on, are quite easy to automate. But you can still take a customer partway through a process and capture some really useful information, and then maybe find out the right person to complete that task for them. So the overall experience is really seamless and joined up. And actually, even though the bot or the conversational AI didn't completely fulfill the task, it helped the agent on the other end of that experience, close the job down. I think that's an important thing to think of from an end-to-end, joined up journey.
Yeah, and just to, hit a real kind of solid point when we talk about this, is when we talk conversational, it means you have to have for us a human backstop, that there needs to be, and customers don't want to repeat themselves, and that it's so important to ensure that the context of that conversation you've had up front is complementary to what the agent is then picking up, so the agent can see the context and you're handing that full conversation over into the agent so they can do their job better. It should be considered part of an overall productive experience. And I think I saw a great presentation once again about bots versus agents. And it was actually that they should be combined. They should be best friends. They should be working together. That's the ideal experience, not either.
Too. So when I think about the use of conversational AI, at least today, right, I always think of it as if you put every customer interaction on a 2x2 grid. In analysts, we always put things on 2x2 grid. So anything that's high frequency, low complexity, that's the ideal use case for your IVA, right? And anything else you want to be able to flip to a human to be able to handle that because it's a little more complex. So, tell me my flight status, it's fine. Change my flight from New York to London to Barcelona and add a 4-hour stop in Madrid, not so good, right? Now, but that doesn't mean that's always going to be the case, right? And so I think, Dave, you had mentioned, or I'm not sure if you were still there, you can't understand certain nuances and things, but that's changing, right? There's a lot of work being done in sentiment analysis, emotion detection, things like that. So, over time, do you eventually see this being used for, many, many more cases, or is it likely to stay something that kind of stays with these simple, repeatable, high frequency interactions?
I can add something to that. So I think where we are right now, still to some degree, is I think because of the complexity of huge amounts of data and the human language being so tangled in its data sets, things like speech recognition, synthesis, semantic analysis, syntax, sentiment, common sense. I think brands think it's easy, but it's actually really difficult. We as humans in a conversation have common sense. We have real world understanding, real world knowledge. So there's things that are maybe slightly off in the future still in terms of what conversational AI can bring. And I think it's still in its infancy to some degree. But I would say that the machine learning and the deep neural network advancements are critical for improving the processing power and evolving conversational AI. I think in its current form, you mentioned this, Stu, many experiences in the conversational AI world are programmed rather than if nobody anticipates the rule or utterance, it does not exist. They don't understand it. And it's very much human in the loop as opposed to machine learning. So I think the kind of the neural networks that have the capacity to understand noisy information, messy structures will really change the way in which these can be built. And I think that they'll be able to make inferences on huge data sets, understand context they haven't been taught. And that's really, I think, what people think machine learning is today, but in many cases it really is there. And I think this would start to meet that level of human expectation that we want from conversational AI. I think we've talked about Siri and Alexa. You mentioned it. I think the data shows within about 3 weeks of buying it or interacting in, usage drops off a cliff. And that's because it's not meeting the standards that we expect today.
Yeah. I'd add to that as well. So I think totally agree with everything that Dave was saying there. And, we will see inevitable improvements in the capability of the technology in terms of its performance, its ability to recognize and understand, and also crucially, the ability for designers to much more easily create complex experiences, with less and less, input, if you like, with less and less hours, if you like, to design those experiences. And that will probably just see incremental gains, year on year, and will allow more to be done. I think the other side to it as well is thinking about, just design more generally and user interfaces and what's an appropriate user interface for a specific task. And as an example, we can read faster than we can listen. So playing information back to somebody audibly, playing back, and I use this example quite a lot. Let's say, for example, I go to Alexa and ask it the weather. It takes about 20 seconds to play me back. The weather today is, and it tells me the weather. If I ask something with a screen, Siri, I can see within half a second exactly what's happening over the course of the next week or so. So it's really easy for me to input information with my voice and get specific, get a precise command across. But then in terms of interpreting that information, it's much easier for me to do that through a screen. And really that just comes down to user interfaces being appropriate for different things. And the same, by the way, applies to humans. It's really hard for a human in a call center to get across complex information about maybe lots of different products or services, giving the customer choice. The customer can see that, but combine that with a voice input to a human, it's often a more effective way of combining things. And like I say, the same applies to AI. So it's about the appropriate UI for the appropriate task.
Yeah. Now we've talked about, up until now, we've talked about, conversational AI as part of the bot process or IVA, which makes some sense. But this is a tool that can also be used as an agent assist tool, correct? Like Stu, I know you and I, when we were prepping, just talked about that. So talk about some of those use cases and how, this isn't a threat to the agent. In fact, it can make the agent better. And how, talk about that.
Definitely. I mean, I kind of refer to this as the second wave of conversational AI. The first wave being your voice bots and chatbots that we've just been speaking about. But the second wave, and I think we're still relatively early on in the adoption of this, but we're definitely seeing more and more interest in it now, is sitting behind a human, having a conversation, typically, with a customer, perhaps in a call center, and listening to the conversation, interpreting in real time what the customers are asking or maybe what the agent's offering, and being able to offer assistance to the agent to help them do their job more effectively. And there's a number of different formats that takes. It could be, for example, suggesting a next best action, or it could be offering up a bit of knowledge in real time, so that if the customer asks a complex question, immediately the agent's got that information there and they can give an intelligent response. It could be offering a suggestive response if the customer's in a chat conversation and they offer up, here's the best response to that question, just click on it now instead of having to type it. Or also what we're seeing a lot of at the moment as well is automatically summarizing the conversation so that you don't have to sit and take copious notes afterwards saying exactly what happened. Often you can save 1, 2, 3 minutes of call simply by having those notes automatically summarized and added to the notes field, so that whoever deals with the customer next has information on what's going on. Compliance, quality, there are so many different use cases that this can be used for. And I think that we're just in the early stages of this phase, which is really quite exciting.
Yeah, indeed.
That's a great point. Yeah, I was just gonna say it in a similar way. I think when we look at a lot of the benefits that the AI is bringing, it's related to the agent, right? We're looking at kind of reducing or improving kind of first contact resolution and CSAT and NPS scores. So they're being scored in the same way, and they're supposed to be complementary from even an outcome and a based approach. But also, when you mentioned supporting the agent, one thing that we see, one of the common examples that I've seen with my customers is kind of ID&V and like early form capture. There's certain things that the agent just needs to get from the customer, and you can just shave 2 to 4 minutes and halve call time down and let the agent do the complex bit, rather than every time having to go through the same process at the start of each of the call where they need to capture, I don't know, it can be either your bank, you're having to go through some kind of security stuff that a bot could do with you. You could be calling a retailer and you might need to provide your order number, your status, and all of that stuff can just make the agent, and not just the agent more efficient, but also routing to the right agent. Mm-hmm. So making sure that you're not going through, many different cycles to find the right agent. And I've seen some bad experiences where they've been trying to do that. And I think the worst one is when you're not qualifying with the customer as well, that's what they want. I called up my bank the other day and they gave me the voice bot option to say, what's your problem? And they just routed me through. They didn't ask me I didn't get to confirm whether I'd understood it or that was where I want to go. And if you say the word tax, you can end up in 7 different departments. So I think it's also about making sure that whilst you're trying to improve this experience for the customer, you're also validating with them that you have understood.
Yeah, it's an interesting, kind of technology for agents, and it's will there be a day where all customer service interactions are handled by virtual agents? Maybe, but I think that date is so far out in the future that I'll long be retired. So
my view is that I think there'll be a time where every conversation starts with conversational AI. It may not be handled by it,
yes,
but I think we're very, very within probably the next few years, but I think we're getting to the point where the first interaction, a bit like you go into a hotel and you get met by the concierge or the receptionist. I think that's what we'll see. That's how we'll see this technology start, and it will increasingly be able to answer more questions. But I think, like you say, we're many, probably decades from it being able to solve every single answer, if ever, because people like to deal with people.
But I do think that's where agents should be. Companies should be embracing this. I think a lot of agents have, rightfully so, some trepidation around this because they think it's going to take their job. But if you look at sort of the shortage of talent in contact centers today, and if you think about so I know a lot of companies that are contact center agents that have changed jobs, and they want to work at a company where they know they're going to be successful. I think conversational AI can almost make an agent a super agent, right? Because you're giving that agent more information, more tools, and just the ability to satisfy customers better. And so I think from just this thing going on there called the Great Resignation, from that perspective, if you're looking to up-level your talent, this to me has to be a core part of the contact center. Would you guys agree?
Yeah. I mean, agents don't want to deal with mundane tasks. They want to deal with actual problem solving and intelligent human interaction. So yeah, if you can free them up to do the things that they want to do, as you say.
And I think, like you say, the biggest problem that not just this industry, but a lot of industries have at the moment is attrition, burnout, people struggling to kind of cope with the job, particularly with home working. And the better tool set you can provide them to do their job more effectively, which for me has to be underpinned by AI to support agents, then you're going to get a much happier workforce, and therefore you're going to be able to maintain staffing levels and get high levels of employee satisfaction, which in turn leads to customer satisfaction. So you need to think about providing better tools for agents in call centers, which has to be, or will increasingly be, underpinned by AI.
Yeah. All right. So we only have a few minutes left. I do want to talk a little bit about roadmap, right? So and where this technology is going. And so without getting too forward looking for both your companies, can you give us, the audience, some idea of what they can expect to see from an evolution perspective in conversational AI over the next 1 to 5 years? And so Dave, why don't we start with you here?
Yeah, honestly, I kind of touched on it before. For me, really, this is around the neural network piece. I think the emphasis on huge data sets. I think if you can trust these things to better understand you'll want to engage with it. You get the value of the convenience, remove the instruction manual, allow the systems to learn with you, gain more knowledge. And for me, that would represent true innovation.
Yeah, and just from my perspective, I think, probably the true innovation that we've seen with this technology over the last few years is the democratization of it. The fact that it's become, the cost of deploying it will increasingly get lower and lower. Whilst the capability gets higher and higher, it's a bit like the kind of Moore's law. That's what we're seeing with conversational AI. So that it will therefore become more and more ubiquitous. And as we mentioned in the last point, therefore, pretty much every interaction will start with conversational AI, whether you're on a website, whether you're on a messaging channel, when you pick up the phone, you're going to be greeted by a conversational AI that will ask you a few questions, act like a concierge, and, maybe in many cases escalate through to a human. But then also those human interactions will also be underpinned by AI, and it will be listening, suggesting, helping out, offering up knowledge. Really, like you say, giving agents superpowers to be able to do their jobs more effectively and in a much more enjoyable way. So I think that's where we'll see the technology heading over the next 3 or 4 years.
All right. And looking at the clock, we have time for one more question for each of you. So if you're a member of the audience watching this and you're sold on conversational AI, but you have no idea how to get started because this is a big sort of complicated topic, what's one piece of advice you can give? Like, how do companies get started with this? So they can, ensure they're deploying the technology the right way, but they're minimizing risk and not using the ways they shouldn't. So, Stu, why don't we go with you first? What's that one piece of advice?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it would be start small. So we have a process that we call intent capture and analysis, and we run it over an 8-week period. And we literally start with a skeleton chatbot, voice bot, whatever, that captures data, and we chat on a daily basis. We grow it, and we give it more capabilities. And at the end of that 8-week period, we've got something that is able to typically, classify anywhere between 50 and 100 intents. And we can use that data to drive the transformation process. So by starting small and iterating, that's how we get to really high levels of performance.
All right, Dave.
Yeah, I think it's a great approach, and actually, it's maybe hit on something that you said earlier. Is in terms of, look at the top reasons for why your customers are getting in contact with you. What are the high volume, low kind of easy to solve, low hanging fruit, low value queries? Look at it from that perspective. Make sure it's measurable. As Stu said, make sure you're wireframing it. And actually, maybe to cut to the point as well, make sure you're working with an expert. Don't try and do it all yourself. Don't just ask an IT developer to go and get some Python coding and go and build you what you want, because it won't be what you want, and it will require a huge amount of long-term support on it. So work with guys who kind of know what they're doing, and seek help from a vendor, and choose a partner.
From an analyst perspective, and I'm a former IT pro myself. I held a CIO role for a while, and I was a big do-it-yourself guy. I would say this is one where I would certainly seek out the counsel of a company like one of yours, or there's many conversational AI companies, but it is a big process that requires lots of training and lots of retraining. But then once those models are built, there's no reason to go build it yourself, right? So I think from that perspective, I think there may be some specific nuances in certain verticals like healthcare and things, but for the most part, companies like yourselves can handle the 80%. And I do want to say to the audience watching, this is an exciting space. I think when you look at the roadmap for conversational AI, we're talking about emotion detection, video, facial recognition, sentiment analysis. There's so much happening here that I would think it'd be hard for a company to keep up with it themselves. So anyways, gentlemen, Stu and Dave, thank you very much for joining me today on this CX Summit session. On behalf of the two, I'm Zeus Kerravala from ZK Research, and enjoy the rest of the summit.